Welcome back to part 2 of our discussion with Gerry McGovern, author of Top Task. We pick up the action with a discussion of some similarities and differences between top tasks and jobs to be done.
Yeah, it reminds me of Steve Jobs, who always, I think, if I remember correctly, always said, more than, I don't remember if it's 2 or 3 steps to do anything was too much, and he would really get mad if there was more than, if suddenly you had to do 4 steps to do something, he'd go mad or something like this. I actually wanted to bounce back on something you mentioned, which is coming from the jobs to be done background. I did find something surprising when I read your book, Top Task. You're saying, and you mentioned it before, that top tasks should not use verbs. Yeah. And I actually wrote that down because I was like, how can a task not be a verb? I wondered if you could maybe expand on that a bit.
It sounds counterintuitive, but configuration is a task, or it's a series of tasks. We did a lot of work in health as well, and you don't need to say check symptoms. Symptoms is enough. In many situations, particularly when you're navigating through digital spaces, starting a link or a structure, an architecture with the most unique word is a lot more powerful and effective navigationally than starting it with a vague. Because a verb is not a task; it's a generic activity. So get, find, these are not find what? The weather, find a recipe, find what? You always need something with it. But if recipes is enough, so sometimes the noun is not enough, but I don't need to, I can see a link called recipes, and I know that should be about recipes. I don't need a qualifier in front of it. So if I have an architecture that begins uniquely, like troubleshooting, configuration, pricing, that is a much more effective, scannable structure than a whole bunch of verbs pre coming before, because the verb is a kind of inherent in the noun. Job.
Yeah, this makes me think of 2 comments on this. So the first is, do you think this is just because, you're focusing mainly on websites, and because we're talking about information architecture, and therefore, if you put prices, obviously what you're going to get is a list of prices. It's not, make prices or whatever other thing you could do. And the second one I've forgotten now. So let's just go with that one.
It is absolutely. My whole has been in digital architectures, and of course, as you get deeper into pricing, so you kind of, in an intranet, it starts with jobs or careers, and then you go a level below. It's find a job, and the other it's create a job opportunity. So that's for a manager in the process. So at a deeper level, the verbs will come out in the process. But if you can get away without a verb, because we are so attention deficit, the more you can load the beginning with the heaviest word, the most uniquely descriptive word. There's a lot of studies I've seen over the years that 2 or 3 words and we're gone when we're scanning. Like if we're not caught by the first 2 or 3 words, the eye tends to bounce to the next sentence or the next paragraph in the process. So I often, when I was training and the writing, I would say, lead with the need. You got to get at the very beginning, get to the essence of the actual thing. And that's in, particularly in metadata as well, in writing title tags for search engines, that, if you're doing loads of conferences, you should really consider having the year as the very beginning of, the actual title rather than the name of the conference, because then, it's the 2020 blah, blah, blah conference. It's the 1919, because often it's hard to differentiate if it's the blah blah conference 2019, the blah blah conference 2018. It's harder to scan that in a series of search results. So the broad idea of beginning pushing to the beginning the most important thing. And often, though not always, that is a noun rather than a verb.
Yeah, so you actually answered my second question, which was around this being also a matter of being efficient in communication, because you're talking about a communication space and that people can scan faster if there's just one word.
Yeah, or the word is unique. See, if you're scanning 10 links and they all begin uniquely, that's a much better architecture than they're a kind of beginning find. The two or three of them are beginning find. So the more unique. See, a great link tells you what it is, but it tells you what it's not. It tells you what it's different from in the process. So terrible links are things like resources or frequently asked questions or knowledge base or vague indeterminate things. But troubleshooting is not pricing. Pricing is not configuration. So getting to that uniqueness, the unique power, is often found in the noun rather than in the verb. Not always, but often.
It seems like almost it's where you're getting. I think that last part is very important. So it's almost getting like to unique names as much as you can, giving things unique names because that creates difference. And that's much easier to navigate.
Exactly. And that common, like we're dealing with a big international organization at the moment, and there's a debate around, do they call it agenda or do they call it program? And over here we call it program, over here. Yeah. And often this part of Top Tasks as well is a discussion of so the essence of developing the task list, the environment, is an agreement on this is the environment and this is how we describe it. Now, this is what we are in 80 words or in 80 short statements. This is what we are from a user's perspective. This is what we are used for. This is our function. This is why we exist in the atmosphere. And then when you get people debating and to get that list together, you're looking at all sorts of sources like search and support calls and competitor websites. So you do a big situation analysis. But key is, like the biggest one we ever did was in the European Union. We did for there was then 28.
I can imagine that is quite a complex.
There was 150 people in the room at one stage. It was a big room in the process. But what would happen is, oh no, we don't call it climate change. We call it, environment. So there's all these debates because different words, but we got to a consensus. We at the end of the process, we got, well, we'll add the two words into the list. It'll be agenda, program, in the environment. Or, there was, I remember huge debates around climate and should climate be part of environmental protection and, et cetera, in the process. But getting people from different disciplines and, the marketing person will say this, and then the support person will say, hey, that's not what they say when they ring up. When they ring up, they're always saying, agenda. Where's the agenda? Is that true? Yeah, and somebody else. So when we're refining the task list, we always try and create a kind of a United Nations of people, because they begin to self-police each other and they begin to learn from each other. Oh, I didn't know you called it that. I didn't. And because one of the core problems in environments is mixed language, that you click on a link, it's called program, and you go to a page and it's called agenda, and you cannot have a good navigational journey if the language is constantly changing. Common language is much more important than common graphical
imagery.
If the words are constantly changing, if it's called download software here, but it's called software downloads, even that small change can disrupt somebody's understanding of the journey that they're on. We still journey in digital based on words.
Yeah. We talked about it a couple of times here already on the podcast, but that's one-to-one one of the major issues in innovation as well, because the way people in innovation teams, they talk about, on the one hand, innovation itself, or what they believe is a user need, or what they believe is the actual benefit of the thing that they're producing. And at one point, you ask 5 people, you get 7 different answers. And then if you're not aligned in projects like this, then you create something that in the end is not going to be useful. It's not going to be useful for the person that it's supposed to actually help in the end. So it's fascinating to me that there is almost a one-to somehow these two things, innovation and information architecture, are related. It sounds almost magical. Like, how do you get all those people to agree? And I know you emphasize this in the book as well, and you alluded to it over what you said before. Is what are all those evidence play, like real user evidence or feedback from the users, and how do you get this? You emphasize this quite a lot in
well,
that as well.
The language of use. You got to use the language that people use. So many years ago, I was giving a talk at a big travel conference. This is about 2000 or 1999, 2000, somewhere around then, and in the process. And I said, about 6,000 people every month search for low fares. And people were, kind of nodding in the audience. Yeah, low fares, yeah. But I said, 6 million search for cheap flights. And, they were shocked, they were disgusted. And people come up to me and says, Gerry, you don't understand the branding, blah, we could never call it cheap flights, but 3 years later, they were all calling it cheap flights. Because when you got 6 million searching for cheap flights versus 6,000 searching for low fares, low fares might be what the branding people came up with.
It's the people that work at those companies. That's how they...
but now everyone uses cheap flights. But back then it was a big, what are you talking about? You don't understand our industry. We could never call it cheap flights. But those airlines, they went to their graves with their head held high. They never used cheap flights, and and I remember dealing with health entities back around the swine flu, the early. So I saw the journey, and it was an interesting innovation. But back then there was huge debates. We can't call it swine flu because we'll upset the pig industry. But that's what people call it, and you do get it from pigs, And no, we got to call it the H1N1 virus in the process and everything like that. And that was about 2008. There was none of that in 2020. It was let's call it COVID-19, let's call it coronavirus or whatever in the process. But also back around 2008, what are we going to do on the page? Let's put a big picture of somebody blowing their nose. Oh yeah, that'll really help in a pandemic. But it was still, and then what do we do? Well, we'll have a picture of the minister saying how concerned she is or he is, and how much money we're investing in this pandemic. And that was the tiny tasks and the ego, but you go to 2020, and I was involved in a number of health, and it was immediately, symptoms, prevention. There was no graphics. You look at, I don't know how it was in the US, but certainly in the UK, in Ireland, in New Zealand, there was no graphics on the COVID sites. It was just pure links to, whatever was isolation, or how to deal in the early days, how to deal with when you were purchasing products, should you clean them from the supermarket. It's all about bang, bang, bang. Here's the things you need to do. Here's the need, and that that was a real top task progression in my experience in the process. And we actually did 4 or 5 distinct top tasks in different countries. We did one in Canada, we did one in Ireland, we did one in Norway, and did one in New Zealand. And back in 2020, vaccine was there first. Even when they had very little on about the vaccine was the number one task in the process. And what was happening was people were finding about vaccine on dodgy websites because the official government websites were not providing information because we're not ready yet. And, so they wouldn't provide anything about the vaccine. And that vacuum was being filled on Facebook, etc. in the process.
Yeah.
So we showed them, you got to say it's not ready yet. It'll be out in another 6 months, but you can't just have nothing on your website about the vaccine because, in the process. And it was interesting as well. We did it in Ireland. They did the top task 3 or 4 times during the pandemic. And the task didn't change all that much. You would have expected a big, but the number 1 and number 2 tasks across the entire pandemic were vaccine and mental health, mental well-being and mental health. They fluctuated from 1 and 2 across the entire pandemic, certainly in Ireland, maybe in another country. So tasks tend to be very stable if you get them right. Like when I talked earlier about the municipalities, 2009, we did a big top task project for Liverpool. It's the exact same in 2022. Why? Because you've got roads, you've got bins, you've got schools, you've got leisure centres, you've got, the things people do don't tend to change. So if you architect based on the top tasks, you tend to create a very stable architecture that will last over time. Because human behavior, we did tourism ones, and people wanted getting here and around, things to do and see, special offers. So the way you delivered special offers in 2000 would be very different than the way you deliver them today. They'd be much more sophisticated and much more personalized, etc. But it's still special offers. So the technology to deliver the special offer may change, but the desire for a special offer. And we did hospitals, and we discovered there's 3 segments of top tasks: before going to hospital, while you're in hospital, and after you're in hospital. So that's not going to change. You might have monitors on your wrist after you're in hospital, checking your vital signs. You might have very different mechanisms, but you still want to know about what's the recovery period, what happens after. Do I bring in my slippers? Where can I get parking? Who can visit? What times can they visit? These questions were the same 50 years ago, and they're the same today. So, we can, and there's often that desire, we want to change this architecture. Why do you want to change the architecture? It's working. Why? No, but, so this unwillingness to create something that will last, or the expectation that everything that we will create will only last 6 months. We can create things in digital that'll last 20 years. We just don't think about going about creating those things and wanting to create things.
Oh, sorry, go on, John.
Yeah, no, this resonates 100% with what people, one of the mantras in Jobs to be Done, which is jobs are invariant in time. They don't change. So this is exactly a similar thing.
I was going to say exactly the same thing. You're kind of preaching to the converted here. I feel like if I'm sorry, go on.
No, go ahead. Go ahead.
I've got a question about the distribution of the top task as a percentage to the tiny task. Is it like a Pareto type of thing where 20% cover 80, or do you see patterns across everywhere?
Total patterns, Scott. We've done about 600 at this stage, and it's extraordinary how consistent, whether it's in healthcare or the IKEA intranet or whatever. So it's the Pareto on speed, It's 5% will typically get about 25% of the vote. So if we had let's say for simplicity, had 100 task environment, typically the top 5 tasks will get the first 25% of the vote, and the bottom 50 tasks will get the final 25% of the vote. And this is extremely consistent, whether it's the European Union. Here, a slightly different thing in the European Union. I'll come back to it in a moment. But it's not the 20/80, it's the 5/25. So what happens on a typical curve is 5 will get 25% of the vote, but 20% will be at 60%. It won't get to 80. You know, so in most of the environments we got, but there's a very small set of stuff, 3 to 5 things in a lot of environments that have a huge demand. And certainly, typically, the first 50% is about somewhere between 8 and 15. No matter what it is, whether it's universities and they emerge very quickly. So the biggest one we ever did. So it's a voting system, right? So you got 100 or 80, and you're looking, and they're randomly presented. And this is something as well. People say this can't work. You can't give people one screen full of randomly presented things. It breaks all the rules of psychology. I've had a number of researchers almost have heart attacks when they looked at this the first time and says, this doesn't work. It won't work. Well, you know, at this stage, 600,000 people have voted on it in 40 different countries. So it works. It looks crazy, but it works. So the biggest one was in the European Union, where we had 107,000 people voted in 28 countries. And the top tasks, the top 3 tasks, I think were law, forget what they were at the moment, but the top 3 tasks had emerged by the 30th voter. So the top 3 tasks at 30 voters were the order changed a little, but it was the same top 3 tasks at 107,000 voters. So typically there are patterns of emergence. So when you get up to about 400 voters, you have pretty good stability in a top task study. You know, at about 50 voters, the first 3 tasks have emerged. So I don't know why this happens. But humans, I'm reading this book on human evolution, and it's showing we're all connected, we're all the same, we all have underlying similar behavior patterns. We all basically have the same wiring in the process. So there are common human behaviors, and what I care about for my health, what I care about when I'm buying a car, what I care about they're these deep core behaviors. And some of them are really essential to us. They're really, really, really very important to us. And that's what Top Task is about, discovering and then prioritizing and keeping the tiny tasks at bay.
And how do you actually come up with this list of tasks? Because, I mean, you describe it in your book that that it's 80% from customers and 20% from the organization. So my first question is, could you maybe expand a bit on this and how you actually find the task? And just a kind of add-on question, which I'll ask straight away, is do you use analytics, for example, something like Google Analytics or something like this to actually discover tasks?
So it depends on the amount, but 80% you're saying you want the sources coming from the user, from the customer, right? So one of the projects we did was with Microsoft Visual Studio. So what we found was there was a whole bunch of independent developer communities. So we spent a bunch of time on independent who were developed, who'd be using Microsoft Studio or Visual Studio and using other tools. So we spent ages out there seeing what are they talking about, what's important to them in the process, in the environment. So that was for that particular study, that was a particularly great source. But we'd also look at search behavior. We'd also look at support calls. Wherever there's a connection with the customer, we talk to salespeople. Often we find one of the most neglected units in 9 out of 10 organizations for innovation or anything else are the support people. They are dismissed and contemptuously treated, and they are a gold mine of wonderful insight in the process. So we always go for support people and try and get top support calls. Let's say when we were doing the health environment, we'd go out into things like Google AdWords, and so you'd put in a word like cancer. So you'd never have a word like cancer in a task list. So you don't, because that's the product. So when we were doing Cisco, we never had RV over 2. We had troubleshooting, we had pricing. So you always keep the products out of the task list. There, you deal with them separately. But when you be doing your research, so we put in cancer and we say, oh, and here's how people search for cancer: cancer symptoms, how to treat. And then you put in diabetes and you say, oh, it's cancer, diabetes symptoms, and you put in another disease into the Google AdWords or whatever. And then you begin to see the pattern. Oh, symptoms keeps coming up, diagnosis keeps coming up, keeps coming up. So you're looking, that's the 80% of sources. And then your job is really to be the voice of, in the actual shortlisting, we don't tend to have customers because it gets very political or sensitive. And, in that, but you become the voice of the customer, and you're always going back to the data and saying, well, that's not how the customers say it in the support, and it's not, and they also say it the same way in the developer communities. So you got all these sources that kind of bamboozle a lot of the people internally because they've never seen most of them before in the process, and you're kind of guiding the conversation based on those 80% of sources. But you don't want to ignore the organizational voice or the organizational language either, because if you go too much, it's like the sheep disowning her lamb in the there's no ownership in the land. So sometimes some of we allow 5% or 6% for tasks that we know are not important, or we might put in brackets a word that is a particular name of the tool, even though we hate using tool names or anything like that. So sometimes that's what we use brackets for a little bit, because you have to give some recognition to the organization. If you just go 100% the language of the customer, they don't feel any ownership, and they kind of distance themselves from the process. So it is a kind of a bringing people along and knowing when to bend a little, but never losing sight of it must be driven by the language of the customer.
It's very interesting. So you're saying that, and I make similar experiences. So when something gets, let's call it that, get pushed in by the organization into the question, you already know that's never going to make the top 5 or 10. That's never going to be a top task. And I kind of have the same experience. So when we do survey, sometimes it's just, okay, it's fine. No, we talked to 20 customers. No one mentioned it, but you want it in there. Fine. And I know it's never going to show up as the most important thing in the, it's just not going to happen.
But that's powerful, Jan. It's powerful because when you've got the voting and you say, well, the top task got 823 votes and your one got 4, and that was you and your 3 team members, probably like in the process, it can be very powerful. Whereas if you didn't include that at all, they'd be saying, but you didn't include. Well, you didn't. But when you see something like 2,640 votes versus 7, it's a kind of, it doesn't always win, the argument, but it's a stark, I kind of, okay,
gives pause at least.
It gives pause at least.
It might not be the thing. They still might resist.
Exactly, but
evidence as we do.
It's a pause, and I find the more, we use that. Like when I'd be presenting architectures now, I'd say, well, this is first because it had 32% of the vote. This is second because it had, 23% of the vote. Oh, why isn't it called program? Well, we tested it with program and it had a 30% failure rate. But when we tested it with agenda, it only had a 10% failure rate. So you're kind of taking content out of, and because often these words areas, you're taking it out of opinion into and using data along the way to say, well, this is the number 3 task, and this is why it's on the homepage, and this is the 45th. So like
now you choose.
How many tasks would you put on a typical survey then?
Well, anyway, so we would have found the biggest we've ever done was 150, 145 in the early days, and strangely people still voted. But over the years, we've found that it tends to exist somewhere between 50 and 80. So the European Union was 77. The Irish Health Service was about 74. WHO was 76. I don't know why. Maybe it's just the methods have evolved, but typically it has come into somewhere in the territory of 50 to 80. You can define a lot with 50 to 80 terms, in the process. So that would be the broad territory of.
And every recipient would get of the survey would get 80 tasks
Yes,
to choose
they
from.
all, and that's what's crucial, Jonathan. Everyone must get exactly the same, but randomly presented. So it's not in the same order, because otherwise you don't have a democracy of voting. I voted on slide. So always resist. The first thing people will say to you, UX people, we have to break the list up. Then it's useless, because you've already gone to information architecture before figuring out what's really important. So you have the courage to stick with that long list, randomized, and everybody gets the same one. Otherwise it doesn't work, because they're not voting on the same thing. And extraordinarily, that was 77 in the European Union, and it was in 24 languages. It was in 24 languages and 107,000 people. And, the top three, I think there was 5 tasks were the first 25% of the vote. That was, when you think of across 300 million people, it was the same top task. In Croatia was the same top task. In Latvia was the same top task. In Ireland, same top task. In Germany, same top task. In Italy, same top task. In Norway, that's another interesting thing. Humans are I said it earlier, there's often much more commonality among, audiences and groups than is internally believed there will be.
Yeah. Sorry, Scott, do you want to?
I was just soaking that up. It's like that exact comment about the. I think a lot of times, we'll say, be careful about this culture and that culture and the other culture. It almost seems like the sensible thing to say, but then we often find that there's so much more common, more similar than these. These differences are almost exaggerated. And I guess from a scientific perspective, the more conservative approach is to not assume they're the same. But yet, in practice, what you've found is similar to what I think I've observed as well. That so scientific, we can't assume they're the same, but in practice, they more often are the same. Like what we value in culture A, culture B, culture C, and if they appear not to, I would probably question some of the translations. Honestly, initially, have we introduced bias accidentally with a translation?
There's that, but there's also, we don't do top tasks research, but our way of applying jobs to be done. And what we found in relation to culture, very often the difference is kind of like a difference in scale. Sometimes, yes, you get very specific differences that you can relate back to the culture. For example, when it's about cooking, Italians think a little bit differently than Norwegians. It's just what does food play, or what role does food play in their lives and so on. Anyway, but most often I think it's a thing of scale, and I have no way to prove this. But one hypothesis for me was a lot of this has to do with, if you give people a scale of, let's say, 1 to 5 or 1 to 10 or whatever, and you ask them to rate importance on a scale of 1 to 5, however you do it, there is within each culture, different numbers mean different things because, for example, the school system or how this, we have this hypothesis that in France, for example, we get usually a tad less they're almost like a level down because the school system is very harsh. You're never going to get the best note. So people tend to not give a 5. So but it's almost just like one step down, and it looks exactly like Germany, but it's not a 5, it's a 4, for example. So there's very often things that we find like this, where kind of the rating scale, you have to adjust it a little bit to what numbers mean. But I have no way to prove this, that's just my.
Jan, does that mean you're finding that the absolute numbers are different, but you're also finding that order is different? It's like, are you saying the order would be the same, but just the absolute numbers are different? Is that
The
what you're
order
saying?
is exactly the order
Yeah.
is the same, but the absolute number is
Right.
different.
So you'd have to
It's
be
almost like it
careful.
just-
Averaging the numbers is sort of the
Exactly.
warning there. Yeah.
yeah. But anyway, I have no idea if this is true or not. It's just what I think.
I think that makes
Sure.
sense. I think that there's cultural aspects, but the core things of I'm concerned about my child's health, or what am I going to do first? Am I worried about this diagnosis? Or we get to these deeper drivers. We care about the same thing when we're going on holidays. I mean, even I discovered even the Swiss are cheap. We just, I mean, they wanted.
There's 2 Swiss in the call,
Oh yeah,
so.
the two Swiss. Good, yeah. I remember did a study, and the
And it's
Swiss
true.
they wanted cheap flights and special offers just as much as everybody else did. In the process, and so we may not admit a lot of these things, but that's there's
Yeah.
much more that connects us than separates us.
I have one question, but it kind of takes us in a little bit of different space. Jonathan, Scott, do you want to?
I just had a question on some part of the book, which was the 7 principles of effective digital navigation. But I don't know if this is really relevant. So, if you want to go somewhere else, it's fine also.
But
I have a quick nuts and bolts, just real quick before we leave the prioritization. You mentioned that often the top 3 emerge after 30, sample size of 30. What sample size do you, for the most part, is there that you feel pretty confident in, or does it really change? Or would your answer change based on a lot of it depends based on the project?
It does depend, but 400 is a good number. If you can get to that, it tends to create a lot of stability. So you'd certainly expect the top 3 to be coming out around 30 to 50, and there might be a bit of fluctuation. Number 2 mightn't move to number 4, and but to be on the safe side, because you're always going to be hitting exceptions, in environments. But once you get out to about minimum of 200, ideally over 400, regardless of what environment you're in, you're going to be talking about a good bit of stability at around 400.
Do you feel the need within that 400 to search for segments or groups? Well, here's group A, B, and C that may have different priorities.
Yeah. So in any top task study, you would have those segmentation questions. So really you'd want to be looking for about 50 in a segment, and a minimum of 25. So, 18 to 25-year-olds, 25 to 34. So you want a minimum of 25 in any one of those segments, and ideally 50 or more to get, good insights in the actual process. And you see these really interesting patterns, like when we were doing the health one, we'd see exercise. It would be rise high, and then it would start dipping into the 20s, and it'd dip down into the late 30s and and then people would start voting for exercise more. So you could kind of see, how people go out of exercise or stop thinking about exercise between their 20s and 40s, and then realize, oh God, I better start doing more exercise. So by doing that segmentation, you begin to see the actual patterns in the process, and so sometimes you would see these different. Certainly, older people, so in older people, in a health environment, they wouldn't be voting so much for symptoms, because they know what they're dying from. In the process, they're already diagnosed for many years. So whereas younger age groups would be the symptom.
Do I have it?
Would be stronger. So you'd see these quirky differences, not so much quirky, but that's why it's good to really think about your segmentation. But you you're wanting a minimum of 25 in each segment, and ideally 50 plus, so that you can say, yeah, that's a good feeling for that segment.
And you have very nice illustrations, graphics in the book, where you have different confidence intervals and all this.
Yeah.
And I was just wondering what tool you use to actually do
Well, we
these.
did it ourselves, over the years.
Okay.
So basically, we just we created our own little tool over the years and just refined it in relation to what was the best way to present the data in the process. So it was a custom Excel plugin.
Okay. Wow. Yeah. I have one question that kind of it moves maybe one step further and goes into probably what you, Jonathan, were also thinking about, which is, let's imagine we do all the top tasks, we do the study, we know it's these 3 or 4 or 5 or whatever, so probably the 3. Now, how do you go about improving stuff or websites? How do you go about improving for those 3 or 5 top tasks? How do you know that what you're doing is actually contributing?
What you do? Okay, well, I go back to the Cisco, the downloading software, because we worked with them for 10 or 12 years. I'm still working. I'm semi-retired now. But
I love this. Usually, semi-retired people are the busiest.
I know. Well, I'm writing books. I'm writing a new book. It's a kind of.
How you see it? So there you go.
I know. It's a terrible. So right, you got download software. You got. So the next step we'd say is, how is it performing? So how do we know it's working or not working? So we'd come up with examples. So one of the examples, the instructions was download the latest firmware for the RV/over2 router. So we went out and we get network engineers and we give them that task and we'd watch them and we'd say, oh, you got a 60% failure rate. Why is it a 60% failure rate? Because 60% of them couldn't find the right firmware, the latest firmware to download. And of those who download, the 40% were successful, it took them 400 seconds. So the philosophy of top tasks is that you manage the task, not the architecture. So at that stage, there was a 14-step process to download software, and it took an average of 400 seconds. And within 3 years, it had dropped to 4 steps and 40 seconds. And the reason there was that it became an awful lot easier to download software is that the model of measurement of the team changed. So before we introduced top tasks, if you were a software developer in Cisco and you'd come up with the latest version in your team for the RV/over2 router, once you had uploaded that to the system, once you had tested was the firmware working and everything like that, and once you had uploaded, you were finished. You had no more responsibility. So basically, nobody had any responsibility for the network engineer finding the right version of the software. So we shifted the metrics away from the software team finishing and testing the firmware to the network engineer finding and downloading the right firmware.
Okay.
And as soon as we changed, so instead of, it was like a shift from managing the input, which was the software, to managing the outcome, which was the engineer finding the right latest firmware. And as soon as we did that, it dramatically changed how the team thought about, and they said, we don't need this step, we don't need that. What's this step for? So we went from 14 steps to 4 steps, and it never goes clean. You need to go iteratively through those in process. But they had an incentive to remove now because they wanted to improve the success. Because we could show, look, people are failing at step 5 and you don't even need step 5. Why do we need step 5? And people are spending ages on step 7 because far too many options here and you don't really need most of them. So now the incentivization is improve the success rate, reduce the time. Now you've got the reason to remove. In the reason to take away in the process. So that's how you know. So we've got the top task, and everyone says, "Oh, great, let's go on and do our jobs on the tiny task." And you say, "No, hold on. Now, how are the top tasks actually performing?" That's the next question you should ask. Let's see, what is it like to do the, oh, right, okay, and the only way I know how to do that really is to actually observe real users trying to do that thing that, so the vaccine, what's their number one concern? Is it availability, long-term side effects of the vaccine? Okay, you can't, so to speak, conclusively answer that because but you can say, well, we can't answer that conclusive, but on all the evidence that we have at the moment, did they find that information? Were they satisfied that it was a sufficient and a logical answer, in the process? Can they book the vaccine? At a local, did they book it successfully? You test iterations or examples of those critical things. And then that begins to drain the energy away from the tiny task conversations because the team begins to orient itself around troubleshooting, around, we did the European Parliament, or we're working with the European Parliament, wonderful group of people internally. And, we discovered, what do you think the top task in the European Parliament is? It's really obvious. Think of the most obvious.
How to vote, or how to...
No, well, the European, what does a parliament do?
The parliament itself.
Yeah. If the parliament was a sausage factory, what would it be producing? What sort of... Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
So it's law. So the top task was law. And people went, my God, is it law? Oh, of course it is. Yeah, we're a parliament. It was like it is law. It was like, now, is it easy to find law? Well, not exactly, Okay. So sometimes it's like this bone-crunchingly obvious thing that, no, but I thought it was, the latest video of the head of the European launching this or a virtual 3G tour of the Parliament building, or a countless other millions of other things that, we could be. No, it's actually law, and there's, how the law is made, the impact of the law, where the law is currently in the legislative process. It's all these things. Yeah. Oh, that makes sense.
Yeah.
And sometimes
it's like it's hidden in plain sight. Like,
hidden in plain sight.
Once you have it, of course it is that way.
Yeah, but the unfortunate thing often is that the top tasks are not owned by any of the people that you're dealing with, or that the top to manage a top task requires a multitudinous effort throughout the organization of collaboration, because there are multiple different parts that have responsibility, and it's much easier to organize based on silos in the pro. So it really throws up a lot of challenges that require the organization to behave differently, to manage the task rather than the. So
So have you had people, organizations actually reorganize around a specific task? So instead of having silos, have you seen organizations do that?
Yeah, with varying degrees of success. Like certainly one of the things we discovered in the overall top tasks in Cisco was, so when we observe people, we find there's this concept like twins, that tasks tend to have two mental journeys. So let's say you've got your phone and the battery isn't working. So in 100 people, about 40 people will say, oh, what phone do I have? They'll go on an object-oriented journey. Say, I've got an iPhone 8, so I want to get to the iPhone 8 page, and then I look for troubleshooting. And another 40% will be more an object. What's the thing I'm trying to do? Oh, it's troubleshooting. So I'll go to the support section and I look for. So what we discovered as we dug into the download software and the process and we watched the journeys is that some a considerable number of people were going to the RV over 2 homepage and expecting to be able to find the ability to download the firmware in that page, but they could only do it if they went to the support website. So over time, and we found that this concept that product is the hub, that for the install the RV over 2, and you need to go to the communities, and but a lot of people were going to the RV over 2 and looking for installation. So what they began to do was architect a products page where you could get everything from. Whereas they used to have, this is the products page for marketing, this is the product page for community, so you might have 5 or 6 product pages for the RV over 2. And we got, not always, but in a number of their areas, a unification of the products environment, that there was one products page and you could find everything from it. And we could prove that this was a twinger that, people expected to solve, that they were thinking, I've got an RV over 2, I've got a troubleshoot problem with it. A lot of people were wanting to find the RV over 2 page and then find troubleshooting, whereas historically Cisco was architected, no, we've got this troubleshooting data management system, you got to go to it and then look for the RV over 2. So they had to distribute the RV over 2 troubleshooting information to a link to the RV over 2 homepage, and that required a lot of redesigning to get both journeys. So that was a big change that happened. I don't know whether they've continued on with that change over the years, but we see that in a number of environments where we're doing some work with the International Telecoms Union at the moment, and there's the events is huge, but they've got events all over the place. So how did they bring all those events together? But they are a very collaborative organization, so they've loads of meetings and study groups, so they're constantly organizing events, and their members are saying it's really hard, because sometimes it's called agenda and sometimes it's called program and sometimes this is here and that's it. So trying to get a unified architecture for events that all the various parts of the organization will agree with, it's hard. And we make some progress in a number of environments. I think you could look at now a lot of, say, the UK municipalities have a common architecture, and there's a reasonably good justification to say that was maybe not wholly because of Top Task work, but we have done Top Tasks with about 20 or 30 or 40 different municipalities in the UK over the years. And we began to develop a common architecture, which did become common across many of the municipalities. So we did see those changes, but could I ever say, wow, we got 100% success? It's so hard, this work, because you are pushing against, these ego driven in environments. But I think the idea of we have got tasks, and to even think about managing tasks, 20 years ago, people wouldn't even agree that people had tasks. Some progress, not as much as I'd have liked. Some teams beginning to have oriented a bit. The European Union began to pull their laws together as well, but I'm never quite satisfied.
Actually, just a small thing is that in the book you distinguish between tasks and goals. You say avoid goals, also, which I thought was also kind of surprising to me. Could you say a bit more about that? What's the difference between?
Well, a goal is like, I need to spend more time with my family, and a task is I'll book a cheap flight to the south of France.
So it's less high level. A task, a goal is more high level than a task.
Yes, a goal is, I want, this, and the task is how I'm going to go about doing it. So what I find, and this of course is, although Top Task has been used beyond digital, but most of my experience is in the digital realm. And in the digital realm, we have the lizard brain. We really go for the business. We're on that search engine. There's no way you're booking a cheap flight to the south of France. There's no way you're going to buy golf clubs. You're on that journey. When we tend to get in a digital, of course, we waste time. But in other environments on social media, but when we're on the hunt for something, we're really on the hunt for it, and we tend to be very. I need to get this instant. I need to get the latest firmware. So it's not. The goal is I want to keep my customers' network safe. The task is I need to download the latest firmware to make sure that all the software is up to date and protected from latest phishing or stuff like that in the process. So the goal is network protection maybe, and maybe that can be a task at a higher level. But tasks tend to be that more concrete thing. In configuration, installation, it's really getting to the nuts and bolts of, diagnosis, symptoms, treatment, what happens after, side effects, really getting to the stuff that, where am I going to park when I get to the hospital? Do I have to pay for the parking? How long do I have to walk? I've got a bad back. It's really those things that people really care about, and they often. And that's why that's part of keeping the list at 50 to 80. Because if you keep the list very short, people begin to say, "That's interesting. I'd be interested in that." And it'd be that's I like that one. But when you deliberately overload them with this 50 to 80 and it's randomized, kind of the subconscious brain kicks in, and you get that deeper instinctual behavior coming out in the task voting.
Yeah, I feel like we should add another 3 hours, and then because now again 100 different questions come up. So I so enjoy. Okay, maybe think about the listeners again. So if I'm a listener now, I've listened to us talking about Top Tasks, and I really want to do it. I'm excited by it. How can I start? Where should I go? What should I do?
But buy the book.
Yes, I agree.
That's it. And there's lots of information I've written about it over the years. Actually, with Smashing Magazine in September, I have a 10-hour course on Top Tasks. I'll send you the link onto it. It's the first one I've done. I used to do an awful lot of them, and if we have done these projects. I'm doing much less of them now, a small team, but if there's an interesting project out there, I do about 3 or 4 of them a year now, and so there's support. Sometimes I say, "Oh, could we get you for 5 or 6 hours? We just want you to look at the short list to see is it a good short list," or so there's different scenarios in the. And if you're doing something in sustainability or in in helping the environment, I'll give you the help for free. So I spend about 80% of my time now on free stuff, on the environmentalism area. So I'm perfectly willing to help any environmental organizations and give them some free support if they're interested in it. So they are the ways. In the book, I tried to explain it as best as I could, and give away all the secrets, so to speak, of the method. And so that's a good start place. And there is a 10-hour, five sessions over 2 hours, going through in a methodical way the whole process. That'll be sometime in September. So that'll be on Smashing magazine. I don't know if you've ever heard of Smashing, or to do a lot of courses. And they've a big kind of more technical design community. So they're running that. And otherwise, get in touch. You get me at gerry@gerrymcgovern.com if you want to send an email or whatever.
Okay, perfect, awesome. If probably it could happen that this goes out actually around September. So if that kind of lines up, then we can include the link.
If it did, yeah, no problem. Yeah.
So, but I have to. I mean, before we go, I have to ask like one last question at least to you, and that would be, maybe you've been asked this before, I don't know, but what is your top task?
Yeah, I think it's to, somebody described it. I think they were an indigenous person, either from Australia or New Zealand, and they were asked, what is didn't quite say was your top task, but what do you want to do in life, or what would you like to be remembered for? And they said, I'd like to be a good ancestor.
Yeah.
And I think that's what I'd like to be. I'd like to say, at least I didn't add fuel to the flames. I tried to put them out. And at least for the last 10 years of my life, for the first 30 or 40, I did lots of.
You can't vouch for that.
And I can't. So sorry. But I think I was talking to a wonderful scientist there about 3 or 4 weeks ago called Josh Lebowski. He does material science, and he looks at particularly for electronics. And he was talking about how the extraordinary increase in material complexity in electronics design, and how this means that essentially we cannot recycle a lot of electronics, because the material, to get one materials, we destroy the others, etc., in the process. And I was asking him at the end, I said, what can we do, but to try and create a better world, or to turn things around? Well, he said, the scientific challenge or whatever is about to move towards material simplicity. And, but he said, from ordinary people, or people not in the scientific community, so to speak, he said, individually, there's very little you can do. He says, it's great. He said, it's great if you try and change your habits, you should, But he said, if you're buying a Lenovo, or you're buying a Dell, they're really all coming from the same factories. They're coming from the same, the same zinc, the same copper, etc. So you may seem like you've got all this difference, but they're probably all being made in the same. They're not just coming from the same mines. They're being made in the same couple of factories. But he says what really can change things is citizen action. He said since all, in his opinion, all the major societal changes of benefit, whether they were seatbelts, whether they were healthcare, whether they were votes, came from citizen action. And he said he's amazed how little citizen action we have today, for all the networking technology that we have. How 100 years ago or 120 years ago, citizens were much more organized, and not just organized, but they got stuff done. They got shit done. Citizens got stuff done 100 years ago. Where are citizens today? And he said, and you see some signs with the right to repair movement in the process. So I think, if in the stuff, in the worldwide waste, or the stuff like that, and people, we've got to get organized. Because the brands won't change. The brands are making too much money out of this. Even if they individually, managers want to change, they're in this vicious kind of quarterly, churn out the products or the stuff. The governments are scared in many situations. The citizens can hold the politicians' feet to the fire. I think if we don't move as citizens, I saw this wonderful video about 4 or 5 years ago. No, it was about 2 years ago. It was in Barcelona in Spain. And it showed, at the beginning of the video, this parent was brave enough with their kid on a Friday morning to get out in the middle of the street and start cycling, right? And they would bring their kid to school. And they cycled a little, and then another parent joined them, and then another parent joined them. And within 20 minutes, the street was full of parents cycling, and the traffic had to go behind the parents. And 2 months later, that street was traffic free.
Okay.
And I think citizen action can save this planet. And we must, as citizens, become much more proactive. We must get organized.
Gerry, thank you so much for doing this. It was an amazingly, kind of made full circle. I think we started with the environment, we end with the environment. That seems to me like the best point to stop this. Thank you so much for joining us. Thank you much for taking the time and talking to us. And yeah, being on the podcast.
No, it's a real. It was lovely talking to you all. I mean, it was a great conversation, and I feel we're on the same wavelength, so to speak. So it was highly enjoyable, and thanks for taking the time and spread the word.
Yeah, we will. All right, so that concludes today's Product Quest podcast with Gerry McGovern. Please send any comments or ideas for future guests on topics to productquestpodcast@gmail.com. See you next time. Very nice. Thank you so much.
Okay.
Yeah, really enjoyed it. Thank you very much.
Oh, thank you, John.